Welcome to Shadow Fable. Tonight, we venture into the heart of rural Texas, where an ancient oak stands vigil over a place the locals call Dead Man's Hill. Some say it laughs in the dead of night, mocking anyone who dares to wander too close. Others claim it houses a demon summoned centuries ago. Whether you believe in curses or not, let this story serve as a warning. Sometimes, what we do in desperation can echo through the ages and invite a darkness that refuses to die. For the rest of this unnerving journey, close your eyes if you dare, and let these words guide you along the twisting roads that lead to the Laughing Oak. Prepare yourself for an unsettling account of forbidden rituals, restless spirits, and the sinister force that lurks amid the gnarly roots. My name is Daniel Cruz, and I've spent the last few years traveling across America, collecting local legends for a small paranormal blog. The stories are usually amusing, tall tales spun by bored small-town residents. But the rumor of a laughing oak in a remote part of Austin, Texas, piqued my curiosity like none before. The notion of a tree that cackles at midnight sounded ridiculous, but the fervor in people's voices when they told the tale was anything but. They whispered about it as though it were real, as though the oak itself were alive. It was the middle of summer when Daniel arrived in Austin, just before the sweltering heat made the roads sizzle under the Texas sun. He rented a small car and drove west, leaving behind the hustle of the city. The suburbs gave way to winding roads lined with live oaks and rocky hills. The place, known as Dead Man's Hill, was located off an unmarked path. So remote, in fact, that only dedicated travelers and curious thrill-seekers ever found it. By the time he reached the nearest small town, an afternoon haze had settled over the landscape. The streets lay deserted under a scorching sun, and a single antique store stood near a gas station that looked as though it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. That store would be Daniel's first stop. Rumor had it that the old proprietor, Mrs. Fletcher, had stories going back generations. The shop was dusty and cluttered, each shelf filled with old books, rusted implements, mismatched glassware, and local crafts. Behind the counter sat a frail-looking, elderly woman with piercing blue eyes. She rose to greet me, her lips curling into a polite smile. "Afternoon, stranger. Don't get many visitors here in the middle of the day. You look like you've been driving a ways." Her voice had a soft, lilting Texas accent, marked by kindness but also a hidden caution. I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "Yes, ma'am, I'm working on an article, more like a personal project, about local legends. I was told you might know something about the Laughing Oak near Dead Man's Hill. You went looking for that old demon tree, did you? You know what folks say, right? They say it's cursed, they say it laughs to lure you in, and once you hear its voice, there's no going back. You went looking for that old demon tree, did you? You know what folks say, right? They say it's cursed, they say it laughs to lure you in, and once you hear its voice, there's no going back." Mrs. Fletcher's gaze remained steady, and the tension in the air was palpable. Daniel felt his heart flutter slightly. Despite the heat, a chill ran down his spine. "That hill's about 10 miles west, then another 5 miles off-road. You'll see a barbed wire fence that's always half broken. Kids dare each other to go in. But if you're sensible, you'll turn around. There's nothing but trouble there." "I'd still like to see it for myself. Can you tell me any more about the legend? Where did it start?" "Oh, it goes back to the 1800s. A man named Robert Harper owned all that land then. He had a wife and a little boy who took ill with a fever that no doctor could cure. Harper got desperate. Heard he'd do anything for a cure, even if it meant dabbling in dark arts. Folks said he made a pact with something evil under that oak tree. Then, one night, they heard ungodly screams and laughter echoing through the hills. By morning, the boy was alive. But Robert was never the same. His eyes looked hollow, like he'd given up part of his soul. Not long after that, his family vanished. The only thing left was that giant oak and the eerie laughter that sometimes echoed from its branches. After a few minutes of hushed conversation, Mrs. Fletcher insisted Daniel buy a small silver charm. She claimed it would ward off the worst of the evils out at Dead Man's Hill. He accepted it more out of politeness than belief, but he couldn't deny the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. Determined, he thanked her and stepped back into the scorching sunlight, a faint sense of dread trailing him. Determined, he thanked her and stepped back into the scorching sunlight, a faint sense of dread trailing him. The drive grew increasingly desolate. Houses and farms became sparse, replaced by parched grasslands and gnarled oaks. Eventually, Daniel came across a rusted sign leaning precariously against a wooden fence. Private property, keep out. The barbed wire was indeed half broken, leaving just enough space for an intrepid wanderer to slip through. Beyond it, an unpaved track wound its way up a rocky incline. Standing at the threshold, Daniel momentarily hesitated. The Texas sun was relentless, but the air seemed unnaturally still. No chirping of birds, no rustling of leaves. Despite Mrs. Fletcher's warnings, he pressed on. The further he walked, the more he sensed a heaviness that defied logical explanation. It's probably just the humidity and my own nerves. There's no such thing as a laughing tree, I told myself. Still, I'd covered dozens of legends, but few had this kind of oppressive atmosphere from the get-go. Eventually, the path opened onto a clearing at the top of a rocky rise, a place barren of all but a single towering oak. Its trunk was massive, gnarled roots twisting into the earth like grasping claws. The branches extended outward in a broad canopy, offering a patch of shade that seemed to swallow all sunlight. As Daniel approached, an unsettling hush enveloped him. The oak looked ancient, its bark peppered with deep fissures that gave the illusion of a warped face. I found it hard not to imagine the tree was aware. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself. Then, a breeze gusted through the clearing, and the branches rustled with a sound that was strangely reminiscent of muffled laughter. It stopped my breath in my throat. The oak looked ancient, its bark peppered with deep fissures that gave the illusion of a warped face. I found it hard not to imagine the tree was aware. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself. Then a breeze gusted through the clearing, and the branches rustled with a sound that was strangely reminiscent of muffled laughter. It stopped my breath in my throat. Daniel circled the trunk, taking photos. He documented every creepy angle and root cluster, determined to create a thorough record for his blog. Along the base of the trunk, the earth looked scorched in patches, as though lightning had struck it years ago. But there was more. Faint carvings in the wood, symbols, letters, or perhaps runes. Whatever they were, they seemed old, too old to have been left by local teenagers on a dare. Legend has it that Robert Harper, consumed by grief over his child's fever, journeyed to Mexico seeking a rumored brujo, a sorcerer said to possess knowledge of life and death. The brujo gave Harper an arcane rite, one requiring a place of power. Whether Harper realized it or not, Dead Man's Hill was already steeped in energies beyond mortal comprehension. So he performed the ritual beneath the oak, feathers, blood, chanting in the moonlight. On the seventh chant, the demon answered. Under the watchful branches of the laughing oak, Harper bartered his soul for his son's life. The demon agreed. In the morning, the boy woke, his fever broken. But Harper's mind was irreparably changed. Neighbors claimed to see him wandering at night, muttering incoherently. Sometimes he would laugh for no reason, his voice echoing unnaturally. Then the child disappeared without a trace. So did Harper's wife. Farmers who came to investigate found the homestead abandoned. Doors wide open, dinner plates still on the table, as though they had vanished mid-meal. After that day, the oak started laughing on windless nights. People stayed away, naming the place Dead Man's Hill. The sun was beginning to dip, and shadows stretched across the clearing. Daniel debated whether he should camp out until midnight. Perhaps he'd hear, or even record, that eerie laughter. Such a recording would transform his blog from a small curiosity to an online sensation. Despite the danger, the pull of the unknown proved too enticing. I'll stay until midnight. Take a few audio recordings. Nothing's going to happen, but I owe it to the legend and my readers to investigate. Daniel laid out a small camping chair and a cooler with water and snacks. He set up an audio recorder on a tripod, pointing it directly at the imposing oak. The last rays of the sun painted the horizon in swirls of orange and purple, lending a strangely ethereal glow to the tree's silhouette. By 10 o'clock, the Texas sky was black and endless, studded with stars. The only light came from Daniel's flashlight and a lantern he'd hung off a broken branch. The silence was so absolute it pressed against his eardrums. Not even crickets chirped here. He frequently glanced at the oak's trunk, half expecting it to move. Time dragged on. As the hours passed, I felt a growing unease, as though the tree were judging me. The memory of those engraved symbols gnawed at my mind. A primal fear kept whispering that I should leave, that something wasn't right. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. Midnight was mere seconds away. Daniel turned to check the time on his phone. The screen read 11:59 p.m., then total darkness. His phone screen went black, the flashlight died, and the lantern's flame guttered out. He was plunged into night so complete it felt suffocating. That's when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of laughter. Low at first, more like a guttural chuckle echoing from the branches. Gradually, it built in volume, taking on a mocking, resonant quality that reverberated through the clearing. Daniel's heart pounded. Adrenaline surged. In the pitch black, he fumbled for his phone or a spare flashlight, but everything seemed unresponsive. The only thing he could hear was that laughter, unholy, deep and scornful, rattling his very bones. My stomach lurched. A primal terror seized me. I'd heard about fight or flight, but at that moment my body froze as though my muscles were locked. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. Finally, I forced myself to move, to scramble for my gear. In the darkness, Daniel felt something brush against his leg, like a root slithering across the ground. He jerked away, nearly tumbling over a rock. The laughter pitched higher, more frenzied. The presence around him was tangible, an oppressive force bearing down on his mind. Then, just as swiftly as it began, the laughter ceased. The silence returned, more terrifying than any scream. "Robert, you return." A voice. It was so deep, like stone scraping stone. My chest tightened. Was I imagining it, or was the tree itself speaking to me? "You're not Robert, but you smell mortal, curious. You seek my laughter, do you?" Daniel's mind raced. He opened his mouth to respond, but found his throat too dry to produce words. The presence seemed to swirl around him, rustling the leaves in an unseen breeze. "What are you? How are you talking to me?" Long ago, Robert Harper gave me his soul and his bloodline. I remain bound here to this oak, feasting on fear. My voice is carried by the wind. And now, traveler, you are within my domain. Daniel felt a strangling sensation, as though the air had solidified around his neck. Memories of the old stories, Harper's mad laughter, the vanished family, the unholy pact, flooded his mind. Did the demon think he was part of Harper's lineage? Did it even matter? Daniel felt a strangling sensation, as though the air had solidified around his neck. Memories of the old stories, Harper's mad laughter, the vanished family, the unholy pact, flooded his mind. Did the demon think he was part of Harper's lineage? Did it even matter? Many mortals come, drawn by curiosity. None leave the same. Some never leave at all. I could hardly breathe. My eyes darted around the darkness, seeking any sign of escape. But the presence was everywhere. I remembered Mrs. Fletcher's charm. Fumbling in my pocket, I pulled out the small silver trinket. The moment the charm was exposed, there was a hiss, like steam hitting hot coals. The air vibrated with tension. You dare bring that trinket here? A violent gust of wind erupted, slamming Daniel onto his back. The demon's fury crackled in the air, nearly deafening. Yet the charm glowed faintly, providing Daniel just enough mental clarity to scramble to his feet. I clutched the charm with one hand and blindly groped around for my phone or a flashlight with the other. My phone still refused to turn on, so I sprinted, following the outline of the path I had memorized earlier. The laughter resumed, echoing behind me, chasing me through the blackness. Daniel ran as though possessed, stumbling over roots, scraping his arms against branches. The only comfort was the small silver charm pressed against his chest. Moments later, though it felt like hours, he burst out onto the rocky road leading back to his car. To his astonishment, the vehicle's headlights flickered on the moment he came into view, as if they'd been triggered by some primal flight response. Without hesitation, he jumped in and slammed the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. My hands trembled so badly, it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I sped away, never once looking in the rearview mirror for fear that I'd see something chasing me. Dawn was breaking by the time Daniel returned to the safety of a motel on the outskirts of Austin. He locked himself in the room, sank onto the bed, and tried to make sense of what he'd just experienced. His equipment was lost at the site, except for one digital audio recorder in his backpack. He flipped it on, breath catching in his throat. At first, there was static, then faint rustling sounds, and then that laughter. He had captured the terrifying cackle in crystal clarity. Hearing it again made his skin crawl, confirming that it wasn't just a nightmare or hallucination. I had my proof. But what was I going to do with it? Post it online for clicks and likes? The thought turned my stomach. I knew that if I shared it, it would lure others out to the oak, risking their lives for a glimpse of the impossible. Could I live with that on my conscience? If you're sensible, you'll turn around. There's nothing but trouble there. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself poring over historical records in the Austin Public Library. He discovered old land deeds and a single mention of the Harper family in an 1852 newspaper. A small paragraph described Robert Harper's frantic search for a cure for his son's illness, but nowhere was there any record of the family's end. It was as if they vanished from history. I realized that I had stumbled onto something bigger than a mere local legend. The demon under that oak was real, and it was bound there, feeding on fear and the occasional unlucky wanderer. A wave of guilt crashed over me, knowing my blog post might be the next invitation for thrill seekers. Hoping to protect others, Daniel went back to Mrs. Fletcher. He needed answers, some way to stop the demon or at least contain it. She greeted him with a concerned look, as though she knew already how his night had gone. "Mrs. Fletcher, I heard it, saw it. That thing is real, and it's dangerous. There has to be a way to keep people away, or seal it for good. Lord, have mercy. Nobody's faced that demon in decades. Most folks around here just know better than to go out there. But you're not from here, so I guess you had to see for yourself. I have the audio. If I post it, I'm afraid curious people will flock to that hill. Should we cut the tree down? Burn it, maybe? Honey, many have tried. Axes break on that trunk. Fire won't spread. It's bound there by a power older than anything you or I understand. If you want to protect others, you let the legend remain a rumor. You let it fade. The more attention it gets, the stronger it becomes. Fear is its nourishment." Daniel realized that the demon thrived on belief and dread. The more the story spread, the more visitors would come, fueling the cycle. Perhaps anonymity was the only prison strong enough to hold it. I left the antique store feeling torn. My entire purpose was to report local legends, and yet, by telling this one, I might unleash something truly malevolent. The best choice seemed to be burying the evidence, destroying the audio file I'd recorded, but I wasn't sure if I had the courage to do it. My readers expected a story. I'd never withheld one before. I left the antique store feeling torn. My entire purpose was to report local legends, and yet, by telling this one, I might unleash something truly malevolent. The best choice seemed to be burying the evidence, destroying the audio file I'd recorded. But I wasn't sure if I had the courage to do it. My readers expected a story. I'd never withheld one before. That night, Daniel dreamt of the oak. In his nightmare, its branches reached out for him, the bark splitting to reveal countless leering faces, each one laughing. Over and over, the laughter rang until his soul quaked with terror. He woke, drenched in sweat, the silver charm still around his neck. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone and opened the audio file. The laughter that had been so crisp and clear before was now static-laced. He hovered over the delete option, fighting the temptation to keep it. Eventually, in a burst of resolve, he pressed it. The file vanished. Gone. Daniel breathed a sigh of relief, though a knot of anxiety remained in his gut. A week passed. Daniel wrote nothing about the laughing oak. Instead, he posted a half-hearted article about other Texan folklore, chupacabras, haunted hotels, giving only vague references to a cursed tree on a private property, with no location details. Despite the anticlimactic post, he felt a sense of moral responsibility had been fulfilled. Yet the oak stands still, perched atop Dead Man's Hill, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander near. The demon inside grows restless, hungering for fear. For now, it remains imprisoned by secrecy, but for how long? Rumors have a way of surviving, and all it takes is one spark of curiosity, one determined thrill seeker to push past the warnings and cross that broken barbed wire fence. If you ever find yourself in the outskirts of Austin, and someone whispers about an ancient oak that laughs at midnight, heed the warnings. Don't go looking for it. Because if you do, you might hear the laughter calling out your name in the darkness. And once you hear it, there's no guarantee you'll return the same, or at all. Thank you for joining us on Shadow Fable. Until next time, stay curious, but be cautious. Some secrets are better left hidden in the shadows. Tonight, we venture into the haunted ruins of Helltown, Ohio, a place abandoned by the living but never truly empty. Prepare yourself for the secrets buried beneath its soil and the shadows that still linger. It was supposed to be a simple reunion. Rachel adjusted the straps of her hiking backpack as the wind rustled through the skeletal trees of the Cuyahoga Valley. "I still can't believe we're doing this," she muttered, her breath clouding in the frosty air.
"Come on,"
said Connor, her college friend and the mastermind behind the trip.
"When's the last time we all did something crazy? It'll be like old times."
Behind him, Lauren tightened her scarf, shooting him a skeptical look.
Yeah, except back then our crazy didn't involve trespassing in a cursed ghost town.
Helltown isn't cursed.
Ethan chimed in.
It's just a bunch of creepy stories. Abandoned houses, a church with upside-down crosses, that's it. Urban legends don't bite.
Tell that to the people who disappeared here.
Rachel said. Her voice dropped.
Or the guy who said he saw a faceless figure in the woods.
Faceless figures, ritual sacrifices, hellfire. It's all propaganda.
Connor grinned.
You can't tell me you're scared, Rachel.
She rolled her eyes but didn't answer. The truth was, she was scared. There was something about Helltown that felt wrong, even before they had reached the first decaying house. The group's journey began on a single-lane road, lined with rusting, no trespassing signs. The woods closed in around them, and the sunlight grew weak, as though the trees themselves were siphoning the light. They passed the first landmark, the old school bus. Its yellow paint had faded to a sickly beige, and its windows were smeared with grime.
The Satan's bus.
Lauren said, taking a step back.
Legend says the cult used it to kidnap people. They'd lock them inside until it was time to,
That's just a story.
Ethan said, peering into the bus.
It's empty. Probably hasn't been used since the 70s.
But as the group moved on, Rachel glanced back. She could have sworn she saw movement inside. A flicker of shadow, or was it her imagination? She tightened her grip on the straps of her backpack, forcing herself to keep walking. Their next stop was the abandoned church. Its steeple leaned precariously and the door hung off one hinge. The inside smelled of damp wood and decay. Lauren shivered.
"This place is disgusting,"
she said, her voice echoing in the hollow space.
Look at this,
Connor called out, gesturing to the altar. A crude pentagram had been carved into the wood, its edges blackened as if burned. Surrounding it were symbols none of them recognized, but the air seemed to grow colder as they stared at them.
That's unsettling.
Ethan admitted.
Unsettling?
Rachel hissed.
It looks like someone's been here recently. I don't think we should stick around.
But Connor was already moving deeper into the church.
Relax, it's just graffiti. People love playing into the Helltown myths.
As Connor reached the back of the church, the faint sound of a bell rang out. It was distant but persistent, as though coming from deep within the woods. The group paused, exchanging nervous glances.
"There aren't any working churches around here, right?"
Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
No,
Ethan said firmly.
it's probably the wind carrying the sound.
Or something worse.
Rachel muttered under her breath. As they left the church, the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest became a patchwork of shadows. Ethan pulled out a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark.
"What's next on the tour, Connor?"
Lauren asked sarcastically.
The cemetery.
Connor said, his tone far too cheerful.
We can check out the grave with no name. Apparently people hear whispers there.
Rachel stopped in her tracks.
Did you hear that?
The others froze. The wind had died down completely, leaving the woods eerily silent. And then, faintly, they heard it. A low, guttural sound, like breathing. It seemed to come from all around them.
Animals.
Ethan whispered.
It's just animals.
No animal makes that noise.
Rachel said. The breathing grew louder. Shadows moved between the trees, too quick to be human. Panic began to set in. Lauren grabbed Rachel's arm.
We need to leave. Now.
Before anyone could argue, a figure emerged from the woods. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs and no discernible face. Just a blank expanse where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been.
Run!
Connor shouted. The group bolted, stumbling over roots and rocks as the creature pursued them. Rachel risked a glance back and saw the figure multiply. There were more of them now, emerging from the darkness, their faceless heads tilted as if listening. In their desperation, the group stumbled upon an old hunting cabin. The door creaked open as they pushed their way inside, slamming it shut behind them. The air was stale and carried the faint metallic scent of blood.
Barricade the door.
Rachel hissed. They pushed a rotting table against the entrance. Outside, the sound of footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate.
What do we do?
Lauren whispered, tears streaming down her face.
Wait them out.
Ethan said, clutching a rusted fire poker he had found. But then, from the corner of the room, a faint sobbing sound began. It was coming from a closet.
No,
Rachel whispered, backing away.
don't open it.
Connor, ever the skeptic, reached for the handle. As the door creaked open, the sobbing stopped. Instead, there was a sharp, guttural scream, and something lunged out, pulling Connor into the darkness. The door slammed shut before anyone could react. The group froze in shock, but the sound of scratching from within the closet snapped them back to reality.
We need to get out of here.
Rachel said, her voice shaking.
Now.
They reached the cemetery panting and frantic. The gravestones were jagged and weathered, barely visible in the faint moonlight. The group huddled together, scanning the darkness.
Where did they go?
Lauren whispered, her voice trembling.
Maybe we lost them.
Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. A whisper cut through the air. It wasn't a voice, but something deeper, like the ground itself was speaking.
Leave.
The ground beneath their feet began to shift. Hands, skeletal and decayed, clawed their way out of the soil. One grabbed Lauren's ankle and she screamed.
Help me.
She cried, kicking at the bony fingers. Ethan and Rachel pulled her free, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The faceless figures reappeared, circling the cemetery like predators closing in on their prey.
We need to break the circle.
Rachel shouted.
They're trapping us here.
Ethan grabbed a gravestone and smashed it, shattering it into pieces. The whispers turned to shrieks, and the figures recoiled, their forms flickering like a dying flame. The group took the chance to run, not stopping until they were back at their car. They drove in silence, the events of the night weighing heavily on them. As they crossed the bridge out of Helltown, Rachel glanced in the rearview mirror. The faceless figure stood at the edge of the bridge, watching them leave.
We're never talking about this again.
Lauren said, her voice shaking.
Agreed.
Ethan said. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. 2 weeks later, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through photos from the trip. Most were blurry or dark, but one made her stomach drop. In the corner of a group shot, barely visible, was the silhouette of a faceless figure. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan.
Have you felt off since Helltown?
Rachel's hand trembled as she typed back.
Yes? Why?
Ethan replied instantly.
Because I saw it outside my window last night.
Rachel's heart raced. A knock came at her door, loud and insistent. She froze, her eyes darting to the peephole. But when she looked, there was nothing there, except the faint outline of a shadow. Her apartment grew eerily cold. The lights flickered and the knock came again, this time louder, more forceful. Rachel backed away from the door, clutching her phone tightly. Her gaze darted to the group photo again, and she noticed something she hadn't before. The faceless figure wasn't just standing in the corner. Its hand was stretched out, resting on her shoulder. The knock turned into a relentless pounding, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The room fell silent. Rachel stared at the door, waiting, her breath shallow. She wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but she thought she heard a whisper from the other side.
You should have stayed away.
Some legends are best left undisturbed. Join us next time on Shadow Fable, where the darkness never sleeps. Tonight, let us drift into the moonlit roads of rural West Virginia, where shadows move across silent highways, and the sky itself might bear witness to something extraordinary. Settle in, ease your breathing, and let this story guide you through the gentle hush of the Point Pleasant night. We journey into the realm of an American legend that has haunted the imaginations of locals and travelers alike since the 1960s. This is the tale of the Mothman, an elusive, winged figure seen lurking by lonely back roads, perched on rusted bridge beams, and gazing from the skies with eyes that many swear glowed a dreadful red. Whether a prophet of doom or a guardian warning of tragedy, Mothman's presence has never truly left the quiet corners of Appalachia. So, close your eyes if you wish, or keep them gently open. Let this story become a lullaby of whispered night winds, a quiet vigil that carries you deeper into the hush of evening. I first visited Point Pleasant on an early winter night. In my memory, every streetlight glowed with a diffused halo, the cold air crystallizing faintly in the lamplight. Downtown was quiet, as though the old brick buildings remembered the weight of history. A friend of mine, a local journalist named Maria Johnson, had invited me out here. She'd spent years investigating local legends, but her primary fascination was with the stories of Mothman, the winged anomaly that seemed to watch the world with silent curiosity. Something about the legend tugged at her. She'd often mentioned the Silver Bridge collapse and the manner in which Mothman sightings intensified just before that fateful day in 1967. Some believed the creature was a harbinger of doom. Others believed it was trying to warn them. Either way, I arrived to find Maria lost in dusty books and archived newspapers at her small corner office above the local hardware store. She greeted me with a subdued, almost reverent hush, as though we were in a church. I remember the overhead lamp swinging faintly, casting long shadows on the walls. She said she was glad I'd come, that if ever there was a time to take these stories seriously, it was now. I looked around at the scattered notes, the grainy black and white photos clipped to a corkboard, the letters from people who claimed to have witnessed Mothman in some fleeting moment. One letter, typed on an old typewriter, read,
I swear I saw it again by the river. Red eyes. It wasn't menacing, just watching. I remembered what happened before the bridge went down and I got chills.
Maria tapped the letter gently. When did that letter arrive? I asked her.
Just last week.
She replied.
Unsigned. No return address.
My curiosity was piqued. I'd heard the local stories, the way elderly residents would mention Mothman in hushed tones, as though conjuring a spirit better left at rest. I decided then and there that for the next several days, we would wander the back roads and talk to the locals who still remembered what happened 50-some years ago. Who knows, maybe we'd catch a glimpse of something ourselves, though I was determined to keep a rational mind. The air in Point Pleasant had a way of tingling with quiet expectation, especially near midnight. That first evening, I made my way to the bank of the Ohio River, near the site where the silver bridge had once stood. The water was dark but calm, reflecting the moonlight. In that gently swirling water, a sense of uneasy nostalgia seemed to ripple outward. I found myself thinking about how entire towns carry the memory of tragedy for decades, how a sudden collapse that killed dozens of people could scar a community and simultaneously birth a legend that refused to die. A rustle in the brush behind me made my heart spike momentarily. I turned, half expecting a stray dog or some nocturnal creature. The night was silent. I could see the outline of trees along the riverbank and the faint streetlights behind them. There was no movement. And yet, I was certain something had shifted in the darkness. My breath fogged in the crisp winter air, and I took a cautious step forward, my eyes searching for any sign of life. There was none, only the hush of the breeze and the distant hum of a passing truck on the nearby highway. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and wandered back to my car, feeling both foolish and unsettled. I kept imagining a shape in the gloom, perched above me, waiting. Late that night, Maria and I holed up in her small living room. She pulled out a spiral notebook dense with notes. It contained the testimonies of countless townspeople who claimed to have seen Mothman or glimpsed unusual lights in the sky. There were references to the TNT area north of town, an abandoned munitions site from World War II, a labyrinth of forgotten bunkers, overgrown with weeds and littered with murky ponds. It was rumored to be the creature's nesting ground. Locals sometimes joked, half serious, that decades of chemicals in the soil gave birth to something unnatural. Others said it wasn't a cryptid at all, but a spirit, something ancient that took form only when danger loomed. Maria read from one of the testimonies.
I was driving on Route 62, just before midnight, in late fall of 1966. My headlights caught a glimpse of something standing on the side of the road. It had wings, folded behind its back, and two glowing eyes that looked almost reflective. As soon as I slowed down, it shot into the air. The speed was unbelievable.
She lowered the notebook.
This was written by a man named Roger Wilkins. He's passed away now, but I got hold of his daughter. She says he never wavered on his story, told it the same way for years.
I asked her, "What do you think these people really saw?" She shrugged, chewing on the end of her pen.
You know, some folks blame it on a big heron or a barn owl misidentified in the gloom. Others talk about sandhill cranes. But what so many accounts share is the sense of dread, an electric kind of fear that doesn't fade.
Her voice grew quieter.
It's more than just a strange animal. People who see it say it changes them.
We stayed up far too late, going over everything from cryptid theories to local superstition, weaving a tapestry of speculation that lulled us into a vague, restless dream by the time our eyes closed. I slept on her couch with the hazy glow of a street lamp shining through the curtains, thinking I might awaken to find a dark silhouette outside the window. I didn't. But something about the quiet nights here made me dream in shades of gray, of large wings beating against a moonlit sky. The moment I woke, I remembered none of the details, just that lingering sense of having brushed against something unearthly. The next day, we set out to find a local historian named Ronald Hughes. He lived in a tidy house on the outskirts of town, near an old cemetery dotted with leaning tombstones. Ronald was in his 70s, with wiry gray hair and a measured way of speaking, as though every sentence was carefully weighed. He greeted us at his porch. He'd heard Maria was investigating Mothman stories again, and he seemed neither eager nor dismissive, merely resigned to the fact that this legend had become an inescapable part of Point Pleasant's identity. He led us into his living room, filled with rows of dusty books and old photographs on the walls. We sat on well-worn armchairs while he sipped tea, gazing at us kindly.
I remember the headlines from 1966,
he said.
People around here were spooked. One night, a couple named Linda and Roger Scarberry claimed they were chased by a flying man with a 10-foot wingspan. Others swore it perched on their barn roofs. I was just a kid, but I recall the elders muttering about it in hushed voices.
I leaned forward. Was there real fear? He set his teacup down with a soft clink.
Oh, yes. Folks around here take each other's words seriously. If a neighbor says they saw something, you hear them out. Some chalked it up to mass hysteria. Others believed wholeheartedly. And then a year later, the Silver Bridge collapsed and the sightings stopped as suddenly as they began.
Maria was recording this on her phone, quietly, making sure we had his words on file.
Do you think Mothman was connected to the bridge collapse?
She asked. His eyes flickered toward the window for a moment, as if conjuring a memory.
Some people truly believe he was an omen. That's what a few folks said. They recalled seeing those red eyes near the bridge supports in the days before the tragedy. Whether it was a sign of doom or a warning, I can't say. But it's etched in our story, and every once in a while rumors surface again.
We asked him if he'd personally seen anything. He took a moment.
Just once in 1975, maybe. I was driving home from an uncle's place. It was close to midnight. The roads were so dark I almost drove off into a ditch. Then my headlights caught something on a fence post. A tall shape that seemed to have some sort of wings. I slowed, my heart pounding. And for a split second, I swear it turned its head. The eyes were red like the embers of a dying fire. Before I could blink, it was gone, melted into the night. That could have been a trick of my imagination or an owl with a reflection in its eyes. But I'll never forget the fear I felt. How my stomach dropped as if I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to.
He offered the recollection without drama, matter-of-factly. That calm certainty unsettled me more than any theatrical claim could. After all, what would he stand to gain from scaring us with tall tales? He was just telling us what he remembered. We thanked him for his time, parted ways, and found ourselves strolling the downtown streets, overshadowed by the old Mothman statue that now stands near Main Street, its polished metal wings outstretched, red glass eyes glinting in the sunlight. Point Pleasant had embraced the legend for tourism, but behind the postcards and souvenir shops lay a genuine sense of reverence. The people who lived here treated Mothmen with wary respect, neither mocking nor fully accepting, as if they were all living side by side with some silent guardian or harbinger. That evening, we decided to explore the so-called TNT area, about 6 miles north of town. An old friend of Maria's, a park ranger named Devin Moore, agreed to take us out there on one of the smaller trails. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a ready smile that never quite reached his eyes. He told us he'd grown up hearing about strange lights in those woods, about guttural screeches that set dogs barking for miles around. He never put much stock in those rumors, until recently, he said. Devin led us to a dirt path that snaked through thick underbrush. Night was falling, and the silhouettes of gnarly trees stretched skyward like dark pillars. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could smell the faint, tangy scent of swampy earth. We passed the remnants of old bunkers, concrete igloos that once stored explosives for World War II. Moss clung to the walls, and our flashlights revealed graffiti and broken glass. Every footstep seemed to echo off those curved walls, making it sound like we were never truly alone in there. Devin's voice was low.
A few months ago, a couple of hikers came through here and reported hearing massive wing beats overhead. They thought it was a huge bird, but they also said they saw red eyes peering at them from a tree branch. They left in a hurry and refused to come back.
Maria cast her flashlight beam around, illuminating a twisted trunk.
Any chance they saw an owl?
He shrugged.
Could be, but folks around here know owls and hawks. They said this was bigger, much bigger.
As we ventured deeper, I felt a subtle tension. We each became hyper-aware of rustling leaves or snapping twigs, glancing up at the treetops where the moonlight pierced through the canopy. The deeper we went, the quieter it seemed to get, as if the wildlife itself was holding its breath. I found myself thinking of the stories I'd read, how Mothman was sometimes described as not just a flesh and blood creature, but something paranormal, stepping between worlds or times of crisis. My flashlight caught an old sign, half collapsed, warning about hazardous materials. The swirling patterns of mildew on its surface reminded me of staring eyes. We reached a clearing near a small murky pond. Devon told us that years ago, people dredging around here found half-buried scraps of old machinery, rusted barrels, and even animal carcasses. It was a place that felt steeped in leftover poison. As the wind rose, I caught a distant sound, like a faint metallic screech. I froze, scanning the horizon. Maria whispered,
Did you hear that?
Devon nodded slowly, shining his flashlight across the water. An overwhelming sense of being watched pressed in on me. It wasn't fear exactly, but a tingling awareness that pricked the hairs on the back of my neck. My gaze followed the circle of light across the pond's surface, reflections shifting. For an instant, I thought I saw a pair of faint red points in the darkness, across the water near the edge of the tree line. I opened my mouth to speak, but then a rush of wind passed overhead, stirring the bare branches in a sudden commotion. We all jerked our flashlights upward, and I swear there was a dark mass gliding above us, silent, cutting across the canopy at uncanny speed. The three of us froze in place, adrenaline jolting us awake, Maria's breath caught in her throat. Devon said nothing, just kept the beam roving across the treetops. When the branches settled, we were left with an eerie hush again, as if the swamp had momentarily exhaled. I tried to rationalize it, a large bird spooked by our presence perhaps. Yet the impression I got was of something bigger than any hawk or heron. My heart was hammering, and I found myself recalling Ronald Hughes' story, that unstoppable dread. After a few tense moments, we realized there was nothing more to see. We decided it might be best to leave before we found ourselves stumbling blindly in the dark, or worse. The entire hike back, I couldn't shake the notion that we were being observed. Every so often, Devon would pivot quickly, shining his light behind us, expecting to catch some fleeting movement. But no more signs, no more glimpses, just the hush of the forest. When at last we emerged onto the main road, the lights of town far behind us, I felt an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of me wanted to see Mothman more clearly, if indeed that's what had passed overhead. Another part of me was grateful that we'd only caught that dark silhouette. Nothing more. We said goodnight to Devon and drove back to Maria's place, minds whirring with what-ifs. I barely slept, my dreams filled with flashes of red eyes and rustling wings. The following day, Maria suggested we visit the Mothman Museum, an unassuming storefront downtown, packed with newspaper clippings, eyewitness drawings, and a small gift shop. The curator, a middle-aged man named Bill McMillan, was a walking encyclopedia of Mothman lore. He greeted us warmly and gave us a private walkthrough. We paused at old newspaper headlines. Couples see man-sized bird. Creature, something. Mothman spotted again. And the final chilling coverage of the Silver Bridge disaster. Photos of the twisted wreckage, black water swallowing up cars, rescue boats scouring the river. December 15th, 1967. 46 people lost their lives. That day was etched into the region's collective memory. I asked Bill what he made of the phenomenon. He chuckled softly.
I get that question every day. Some say mass hysteria, some say cryptid, some say supernatural. Honestly, it's become part of our heritage. Could be Mothman's just a campfire tale, or maybe it's something we can't explain in conventional terms.
When we mentioned the possibility that Mothman sightings had returned, his eyes lit up.
Oh, I've heard a few rumors. People sending in letters, emails, claiming they've glimpsed something. Mostly anonymous. Hard to verify.
He shrugged.
Who knows? This area's always had an aura to it. Some say the land was cursed by Chief Cornstalk centuries ago. Others talk about interdimensional beings. I'm just a collector of stories.
Maria lingered over a display case of Mothman sketches done by eyewitnesses in the 60s. Each drawing had slight variations, but the silhouette was the same. Tall, humanoid, broad wings, and those menacing red eyes. She tapped the glass.
Think about how many eyewitness accounts came in those 13 months before the bridge fell,
she said.
It's too widespread to be one person's hoax. Something was happening here.
We spent the better part of an hour combing through microfilm copies of old newspapers in the museum's archive area. I read about Linda Scarberry, who famously said the creature followed her car at speeds well over 100 miles an hour. Another pair of volunteer firefighters claimed they saw a large bird with red eyes. One man nearly wrecked his truck trying to flee from it. It was as though the entire county was under the thrall of mass sightings, culminating in the tragic event that ended them. I tried to picture that sense of collective fear, neighbors whispering about the red-eyed phantom. Then the bridge disaster struck, and the phenomenon vanished, leaving behind a scar and a legend. As evening approached, we drove back to the riverfront. The sky was streaked with pastel hues from the setting sun. We found a bench near the water, not far from the memorial plaque honoring the victims of the Silver Bridge collapse. Maria set her voice recorder on the bench between us. We listened to the gentle lapping of the current, the rustle of a breeze in the bare trees. For a while, neither of us spoke, as if letting the past mingle with the present in that quiet space. Maria finally said,
It's tragic, really. If the Mothman sightings were a warning, then we missed it. People died. If Mothman's some kind of guardian, maybe it tried to help and failed. If it's a demon or a bad omen, well, it's as though it took something from us. Either way, it's become more than a story. It's woven into the identity of this town.
I closed my eyes, letting the cold air nip at my cheeks. The hush of the approaching night weighed on my thoughts. You think the new sightings could mean something? Another disaster on the way? She sighed.
I don't want to be alarmist, but you know how it is. When people get uneasy, they start looking for signs. Sometimes those signs manifest in ways we can't fully explain.
When darkness fell, we wandered over to a small diner for a warm meal. As we entered, a cheerful bell rang overhead. The place was quiet, just a handful of patrons. We settled into a booth by the window. The waitress, Lucy, recognized Maria and exchanged pleasantries. When Lucy heard we were asking around about Mothman, she laughed nervously.
Careful you don't summon it by talking too much.
She joked.
You might just get your wish.
At that, an older man at the counter turned to us. He had the leathery skin of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the sun, wearing a fishing cap with a frayed brim.
That creature's never left, you know,
he said.
Saw something just last month near my farm, woke up to a racket in the chicken coop. Grabbed my flashlight and I saw a set of eyes shining. Thought it was a fox at first, but it was too tall, like a man hunched over. Then it spread these great wings and flew right over my head.
He shook his head, voice trembling with the memory.
Nearly dropped my flashlight, I was so scared.
I felt a chill. His sincerity was palpable. Could a large bird of prey rummaging for a meal be mistaken for something monstrous? Possibly. But the intensity in his voice suggested that he believed wholeheartedly in what he saw. After dinner, we thanked him for sharing. He shook our hands and offered a final warning.
If you see it, don't chase it. Best to let that thing alone. Trouble follows it, sure as the changing of the seasons.
That night, restless energy kept me awake. Maria dozed off in her bedroom, but I tossed and turned in my makeshift bed. Eventually, around midnight, I grabbed my coat, phone, and keys and slipped outside. A small voice in my mind told me to go to the old bridge site again. It was as though the place was calling. The streets were mostly empty, a faint glow from streetlights reflecting off the deserted sidewalk. I parked near the water. The Ohio River was calm under the moonlit sky. Stepping out of the car, I felt that quiet hush again. Not a breath of wind, not a single ripple to disturb the reflection of the moon on the water's surface. I took a slow walk along the bank, letting my thoughts wander. The repeated sightings, the sense that the entire town was bracing for something. Was it possible we were all scaring ourselves for no reason? Then, a crunch of gravel behind me made me spin around. I saw a figure standing maybe 20 feet away, my pulse hammered, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. He looked at me with mild surprise, as if he hadn't expected another soul out here. We regarded each other for a moment, and then he raised a hand in a friendly gesture.
You out for a midnight stroll?
He asked, his voice echoing softly in the stillness. I nodded. Couldn't sleep. You?
Yeah, something like that,
he replied, stepping closer. He was in his late 20s or early 30s with gaunt features and a weary expression.
I come out here sometimes hoping to, I don't know, see something.
Mothman? I ventured. He hesitated, then gave a faint nod.
I saw it when I was a kid, I think. My parents told me I was imagining things, but I know what I saw.
He stared at the water, eyes distant.
I just want to see it again, to know I'm not crazy.
I glanced at him sympathetically. You believe it's real? He let out a shaky laugh.
I do. I wish I didn't, but I do.
He looked at me then, his gaze intense.
Sometimes I wonder if it's drawn to us or if we're drawn to it, like a moth to a flame.
We stood there for a time, both peering at the empty expanse of the river, as though something might emerge from the darkness. But the night offered no revelations. Eventually, he said goodnight and walked off, leaving me to stare once more into the silent void. I was about to head back to my car when a curious phenomenon caught my attention. Across the water, near the far bank, 2 small lights glowed faintly. They seemed out of place, like distant flares. I squinted, trying to discern if they were streetlights or reflections from a passing vehicle. Then, to my mounting unease, they shifted, almost like eyes turning slightly. A wave of goosebumps prickled across my arms. Was it just some trick of perspective? Possibly a pair of lights from a distant house? I lifted my phone, zooming in with the camera, but the screen was too grainy to make out anything. For a moment, the lights seemed to rise, as though whatever it was had stood up taller. Then they blinked out. The sudden darkness felt like a door slamming shut. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay still a bit longer, scanning the shore. No further movement. Finally, the cold got the better of me, and I hurried back to the warmth of my car, uncertain whether I'd just witnessed a random pattern of lights or something far stranger. The next morning, I told Maria about the encounter. She listened, eyes wide, a spark of excitement in her voice.
You might have seen it.
She whispered.
Or something else. This is how it happens. These fleeting glimpses.
We decided to spend the day seeking out more townsfolk, especially older residents who lived through the original sightings. A few were wary of talking, but an elderly woman named Margaret, who lived in a small, tidy home near the outskirts, welcomed us in for tea. She was in her 80s, sharp-minded, with a gentle smile. She spoke with a soft Appalachian drawl, drawing out certain words. She recalled how the entire town was abuzz in late 1966.
I was a school teacher back then. My students whispered about giant birds lurking in the trees on their way home. Some of the younger ones had nightmares. Then you'd hear the grown-ups at the grocery store. One saying they saw Mothman perched on a utility pole, another claiming it chased them to their doorstep.
She shook her head, her gaze falling on her teacup.
We were all frightened. People triple-locked their doors at night, though we weren't sure if a lock could stop a thing with wings.
Maria nodded sympathetically.
Then the bridge. Do you remember that day?
Margaret's eyes took on a mournful look.
Yes, it was close to Christmas. People were out shopping or heading home from work. The bridge was packed. And then...
She paused, collecting herself.
It gave way. The cables snapped like threads. Cars and trucks just fell into the freezing water. It was horrible. I lost a cousin that day.
Her voice trembled slightly.
We mourned. We wept. And we tried to move on. And the rumors started that Mothman had been seen on the bridge's cables just hours before. People said it was a warning. Some said it caused the collapse. Grief does strange things to folks. It can push you to seek explanations beyond simple engineering failures.
We thanked Margaret for sharing her memories, letting her know that we hoped to honor the story with respect for those who lost their lives. As we left, she called after us softly.
Not everything is meant to be understood. Sometimes we live in the shadow of things bigger than ourselves. That's all right. Just be careful.
In the days that followed, that sense of watchfulness never dissipated. Word got around that Maria and I were collecting new accounts. We received phone calls, letters slipped under her office door, and even social media messages from people claiming to have spotted a dark figure with wings near barns, highways, or the old TNT bunkers. Many expressed the same atmosphere. A hush fell over them, a sense of being singled out by something they couldn't quite see but felt. Some described a fleeting sense of sorrow or dread, as though Mothman radiated an emotional aura. Others felt oddly comforted, like it was looking over them with a solemn kind of pity. Maria wanted to gather a small group one evening for a watch along the riverside, just to see if anything might occur. It felt like a long shot, but we convinced Devin, the park ranger, and Bill, the museum curator, to join us. Around 9 p.m., we set up a few camping chairs, thermoses of coffee, and a couple of cameras by the water's edge where the old silver bridge once stood. The lights from the modern bridge upstream twinkled in the distance. The night air was chill, a faint breeze tugging at our jackets. We chatted softly, trading stories about cryptids and odd experiences. The hours trickled by without incident, the conversation lulling into a comfortable hush. Sometime after midnight, the river was as smooth as polished onyx. Devin pointed across to the far bank.
Hey,
he whispered.
Look at that.
We all followed his gaze. Across the water, near a copse of trees, we saw what looked like a dark mass shifting. It was too far to discern any shape, but something about it caught our attention. Bill took a pair of binoculars, squinting.
I can't see details, but it's big,
he muttered. Then, in an instant, it was gone, melting into the tree line. We traded glances, hearts pounding. Maria exhaled in a rush.
It could have been a large bird roosting,
she said, almost to reassure herself. But there was a collective tension in the air that suggested we'd witnessed something more. We waited another hour, scanning the area with flashlights, but nothing re-emerged. Finally, cold and tired, we packed up. We trudged back to our cars in tense silence. Even though we hadn't gotten definitive proof, that fleeting shadow was enough to rekindle our awe and caution. Sitting in her car, Maria stared at the empty horizon,
Part of me wants closure,
she admitted.
I want to know if Mothman is real, if it's some undiscovered species or spirit. Another part of me wonders if the mystery is best left alone. Maybe it's not meant to be pinned down.
I couldn't argue with that. We'd spent days immersing ourselves in Point Pleasant's story, chasing fragments of sightings and memories. The deeper we went, the more elusive the truth became. Yet, the energy around town felt charged, as though Mothman was indeed stirring again, whether physically or in the collective psyche. The next morning, we prepared to say our goodbyes. We'd gathered so much material, enough to fill notebooks and recordings for months of research. Before I left, I took one last walk through the streets, the sun shining on old storefronts that still bore vintage signs. I stopped by the riverfront, gazing at the reflection of the sky on the rippling water, thinking about the innocent lives lost decades ago and how a cryptid legend had grown around that tragedy. I felt a wave of empathy for the townsfolk who lived with the tension of not knowing if their stories were harbingers or guardians, myths or flesh. Perhaps the truth was somewhere in between. That evening, as I drove out of the Point Pleasant, the horizon stretched out before me in golden twilight. I glanced in the rearview mirror at the receding silhouette of the water tower and the cluster of small buildings behind me. A flicker of movement above the treetops made me slow the car. I peered through the windshield, scanning the purpling sky. Nothing. Only the hush of the open road and the last traces of daylight. I exhaled, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light. Yet, a tiny, persistent part of me held on to the possibility that perhaps Mothman was real. Lingering in the twilight, watching the world from a vantage we barely understood. And so, I left West Virginia with more questions than answers. A swirl of eyewitness accounts, spectral glimpses, and a quiet sense of awe. Some part of me believes that Mothman is neither wholly benevolent nor malevolent, but something else entirely, tethered to human fate in ways we cannot fully fathom. Whether it's a creature of flesh and blood, a spirit of foreboding, or a manifestation of collective subconscious, I suspect that for every quiet vigil it keeps, it stands at the threshold between everyday reality and the realm of the unknown. Though the sun set on my journey, the night for Point Pleasant lingers on. Perhaps, if you wander those roads, stand by the river, or brave the old TNT bunkers under the moonlit sky, you might catch a glimpse of a tall, silent figure with crimson eyes reflecting the darkness. But be warned, you may find that once you see Mothman, the quiet hush of the night will never feel quite the same. Your heartbeat might quicken at every rustle of leaves, and every dark silhouette on the horizon could appear to have wings, waiting to unfold in the hidden corners of your dreams. Let these final moments of our tale cradle your thoughts as you drift off. The hush of West Virginia's hills, the patient flow of the Ohio River, the soft echo of a wing beat in the distance. Sleep well, traveler, but keep one ear tuned to that silent vigil. For where old legends breathe, the boundary between the known and unknown is but a thin veil, and sometimes, in the stillness, something watches. In Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the story of Mothman endures as a quiet, haunting presence. Whether a guardian, a harbinger, or a simple misidentified creature, it's become an emblem of mystery. Real tragedies, persistent sightings, and the hush of the surrounding woods weave a legend that refuses to vanish. The people who walk these streets still remember the stories of red eyes in the night, though many prefer not to speak of them openly. Perhaps it's enough to know that sometimes the night hides more than shadows, that, in the silent vigil between dusk and dawn, mysteries may slip through the cracks of our understanding, waiting for us to notice or perhaps warning us to look away. This is the world of Mothman, a world that invites us to stand at the edge of reason, peer into the unknown, and decide for ourselves what's reflected in those eerie red eyes.